Hi, friends. Welcome again to another episode of Beyond the Clouds Edge to Edge Transformation. And yes, a big part of this transformation started during the pandemic when we could not even get basic necessities, forget about cars and other things, but we could not even get our groceries easily. And here with us today is Christian Shu. And Christian has been working on bringing the semiconductor industry and the auto industry together over the last few years. You can't imagine a car anymore without thinking about the entire electronic footprint it has. Christian, tell us about you. How did you become the Christian Shu we know today? And how has your journey been shaped partly by the pandemic?
Well, Shankar, thank you for having me. Good questions. My first TV memory was the moon landing. And ever since, I just wanted to become a rocket scientist. Later on, I noticed that growing up in Austria at the end of the Cold War is not the ideal starting point to become a rocket scientist. So I went for the second best option. I became a management consultant. My very first consulting project was back in 95 at Mercedes-Benz in Stuttgart, Germany. And then I was extremely lucky. I got to work with the very same team of consultants that had invented global sourcing 10 years prior at General Motors with a gentleman called Ignacio Lopez. Back in 95, this procurement competence was pretty new, so this allowed me to assume quite important roles in clients all over the world. So over the first 15 years of my career, I worked for most car makers in Europe and in North America at this intersection of procurement and engineering. In my spare time, I started writing books. The first book I published in English, The Purchasing Chessboard, that got me into the tech industry. I started working for a US PC maker and for the suppliers in Taiwan. So companies like Foxconn also working in China a lot. And basically, since the end of 2018, I'm back in the automotive industry. This was almost an ideal point in time to move back from tech to automotive, because this was basically at the point in time when car makers finally understood that they have to become tech companies. And as you alluded to, the final big wake-up call for car makers came during the first year of the pandemic, 2020, when car makers suddenly noticed that there are things like semiconductors in the car, and they figured out that, first of all, they didn't know which semiconductors they had in their car. They didn't know which companies are making these semiconductors, and they figured out that they had zero relationship to the executives at these companies making semiconductors.
No wonder we found each other on LinkedIn. I was in procurement twice at Sun Microsystems, dealing with design automation companies.
Okay.
And I ended up visiting Stuttgart, Siemens, and Infineon. And they were our customers at Cadence Design Systems. Later, I came back to procurement at Intel Foundry Services and looked at the whole design automation space. This time around, our customers included automotive and the whole 9 yards of connecting semiconductors, foundries, and auto companies. Now, when you started off as a management consultant and you were doing work in Stuttgart with Mercedes-Benz, quality was a huge focus. I would have expected that they would know every single part that went into their car, and that included the electronics. So what was your role like?
That's a good question. In those days, Mercedes-Benz was still riding on a very, very high horse, right? So they were really known for quality. Their cars of those days, you still see them around. There are still taxis running in Europe with almost 1 million kilometers. In those days, it was more given. I didn't hear a lot of concerns about that, because they simply expected it, and they believe the suppliers also understand what it takes. Reflecting on why this was, I believe this may be triggered by much lower complexity. They made very few models. The product life cycles were a lot longer, so there was more time to focus on detail. All the CAD systems and simulation was not as sophisticated, so the engineers probably thought better be safe than sorry, so make it a little bit more sturdy than what the system suggests in order to ensure that we put a car on the road that is reliable. And again, in those days, with very little electronics, so mostly mechanical systems. Today, it's different.
That's true. You worked with companies like GM. What was that like? Must have been a big culture shift working between German companies and American companies.
Of course, in those days, huge difference, right, between German companies, American companies. This was just before Mercedes started the collaboration with Chrysler. For Daimler Chrysler, in those days, they were ready to make the jump to go really international. Nowadays, when you go to Stuttgart, English language is second nature, so very flexibly, fluently shift from one language to the other. And nowadays, these are totally global companies, global cultures.
Yeah, cultures have changed.
Mm.
Christian, I remember your book, The Procurement Chessboard, was one of the more interesting and exciting books to read. Because there was a time when procurement was considered a job you did when you didn't have a good technical background. But people like me with a very deep technical background got into procurement because of the excitement of dealing with the complexities of the supply chain. And your book was like a Bible at that time. Can you tell us a little bit about why you wrote it and what are the most important things you covered in the book?
Yeah, I give you the full background story. The whole thing started in end of 95. Then in my company in December, we had one of these large European global meetings where we showed each other the cool new ideas we had for serving our clients. And in the consulting industry, we call this an IC fair, intellectual capital fair. I was not too excited by the thing I saw, and my colleagues started kind of differentiating between new methods and old methods. If I have to have my appendix removed, and the doctor asked me, Christian, would you like the old traditional method where we go in from here? We now have this super exciting new method where we go in from here. Which one do you prefer? Well, personally, I would prefer the proven method that works, right? For me as a client or as a patient or a doctor, new is not necessarily good. We have to get closer to what our clients actually need. So what is the actual situation our clients in, and not what is new and exciting for us as consultants. And then I spent the Christmas holidays figuring out what this could be. Right? So don't know, is it industry specific? Does it depend on the situation a company is in? So is a company that is growing, that do they need different methods and tools than a company that is in crisis? And finally had this epiphany. It is supply and demand. So it's supply power and demand power. Demand power meaning, so how important are we as a customer to our supplier, and supply power, so how important is the supplier to us, right? And from there, all from this logic, all the decisions flow. And by the way, this is also the way executives think. Right? So explaining supply and demand to a CEO takes you 1 second.
Very true. And then you moved from a very old style, stable automotive industry into the industry of chip makers and systems makers. Very different dynamic. What was it like to be in procurement in the semiconductor space?
For me, absolutely shocking. So this was basically 15 years after I had started as a consultant. I may have been a little bit full of myself, arrogant, so I've seen everything, nothing can surprise me. But what totally shocked me was the speed in the tech industry. So literally 4 times faster than anything I had seen in the automotive industry. And big challenge. So for me, a huge learning opportunity. Under pressure, I came up with new approaches, new concepts, getting closer to suppliers, having a very high cadence of interacting with suppliers. All of these experiences that I gathered in the tech industry. Later on, I applied in the automotive industry, starting in 2018. I condensed all of these insights and recommendations into my most recent book, Profit from the Source, published by Harvard Business Review Press.
Well, you'll have to tell us about the newer book, then Profit from the Source.
The basic concept of this book is to talk to CEOs. My previous books are very much directed to procurement people. That always felt like preaching to the converted. A big transformation in a company doesn't happen from procurement. Very often procurement is perceived as a kind of a dead end to a career. Fundamentally, the change starts from the top, from the CEO, right? The premise is to explain to CEOs how they can leverage getting closer to suppliers to break away from the competition. The sad thing is, most CEOs don't do that. In my book, I mentioned that research by Michael Porter from Harvard Business School, that CEOs on average spend 7 minutes per day on procurement, on suppliers, which is a little bit surprising if you consider that on average, suppliers account for 50% of the budget of a company. And as we said before, automotive industry, so car makers becoming tech companies, a lot of the competence is out there at suppliers, and maybe not the suppliers they work with today, but a different set of suppliers that they have to open up. So there's a big opportunity for CEOs, for companies to embrace suppliers. Right? And inspiration very much comes from the tech industry. Coming back to the semiconductor crisis, I would have believed that all the supply chain troubles that we saw during the pandemic, they would have changed this kind of ignorance, not really looking at suppliers as much as we should. But then in June 2022, the Wall Street Journal ran a review of the book. They said, well, it's all nice ideas, but completely unrealistic, because in the end, procurement should focus on cost savings and leave the rest to the experts. This is concerning, right? Because the Wall Street Journal is like an echo chamber to CEOs, so that they reflect what CEOs are thinking, and in a way they influence the thinking of CEOs.
Yeah.
So this is still a long way to go. So I hope a lot of people read the book and open up to really this enormous potential that comes from really working with suppliers and harnessing all the innovation that suppliers can bring us.
And your timing was impeccable. You came back from semiconductors to automotive in 2018. Yeah. Did you anticipate that there would be a supply chain crisis? Of course, no one anticipated the pandemic. How did the auto industry get transformed during these 4 years since the pandemic?
I would say the automotive industry did not get transformed. The automotive industry was largely caught by surprise by all of this. Then, to different extent, car makers understood how the tech companies are doing it, some of them more, others less. The concerning thing that I observed now is that with very, very few exceptions, their minds are elsewhere. A lot of the good practices that car makers have started to adopt during the pandemic are now slowly being forgotten. When the next semiconductor crisis comes around, they may face very similar problems again.
That is indeed sad to hear, especially given that the pace of these two industries still seem to be widely different. So correct. Are you seeing still a culture clash, or are the cultures getting amalgamated in some ways? Are companies like Tesla an exception?
No, Tesla is a tech company that happens to make cars. Tesla does things very differently from traditional car makers. Now, if you look into China, some of the Chinese car makers, quite BYD, quite similar to the way Tesla operates. I mean, BYD also has tech heritage, right? These may be the two groups of car makers that kind of work in this tech company mindset. I would say the rest of the automotive industry, they understand the challenge, car makers, but transforming these huge organizations is a Herculean task.
But your children and my children, they don't want to see the gas guzzlers anymore. They actually refuse to buy cars that take up gas. It's not that electric is perfect, but there's a sea change in the way the next generations are perceiving cars, traveling, and transportation itself. But do you think that's going to change the way car makers, or in general, transportation is going to change? Or do you think it is just a passing phase?
Macro picture, what I read, the people I talk to, It's quite consistent. You may see the automotive market split into two segments. One segment would be, I just want to get from A to B, mobility, not something I'm excited about. Maybe I want comfort and I want entertainment, but I'm not so much concerned about what's between the four wheels, not so interesting. And then you may have this more like enthusiast type of driving where you want to have all this excitement, but I believe the second market is tiny compared to the mobility market. This is a huge challenge to traditional car makers because in the end, I'm not excited about the mobility.
Very true. The mobility market is completely different from the infotainment or even the people who are interested in autonomy. How big do you think the autonomous vehicle market will get? In the US, we hear about it all the time. Is it realistic? When we hear about BYD and Tesla and a few other companies, is it going to be a significant part of the market, or do you think it'll be basically a mobility market?
One way to answer this would be to say this is like fusion. It's always 20 years away. I don't believe that. I believe this is a solvable problem. And as soon as we really solve this, I think this will be a dramatic transformation of the entire automotive industry. Because then Elon Musk's vision that he voiced when he announced the Model 3, that you would use your Model 3 to drive to work. In the meantime, the car would operate as a taxi and earn you money.
Do you think it's realistic in the next decade or so there'll be self-driving cars routinely going around?
This is not a prediction, this is just a belief. Right? I cannot ground it, but I believe that this will happen. It's not that complicated a problem.
True. But as you correctly pointed out, the culture shift has to happen. Yeah. One of the challenges for something like completely autonomous vehicles is the need to simulate, as you pointed out earlier. You can't be just simulating the car, you have to simulate the traffic, you have to simulate the entire city, digital twins. How far is that technology? Are we now getting to the point where we have realistic assessment? Not yet, but let's wind back a little bit more than a year. In October 2022, who would have expected ChatGPT? So we may be just a couple of months away from a breakthrough on that front. That's true. Technology was around. ChatGPT also was there for 2 years plus, but it wasn't revealed to the public. It's just like the .com days and the internet. It was a huge breakthrough. Now, you said something very interesting. Most car makers are car makers first, and they use technology. And there are a few companies like Tesla and BYD that are tech companies that happen to be making cars. How about you? Are you an automotive guy first who dabbled into semiconductors? Or are you a semiconductor guy who dabbled into automotive? Or are you a procurement guy and you're industry agnostic? I love technology, and both industries, tech and automotive, occupy the same space in my heart, totally. And since you have been familiar with both the cultures, the traditional automotive and the traditional tech and the amalgamation of that, are you the same Christian Schuh who got into these industries and got back? Or have you changed as a person, and your philosophy even around procurement and management, has that also shifted over the years? Oh, that has shifted a lot. I started off as a disciple of the super confrontational Lopez approach. Nowadays, I believe that greatness in procurement, in working with suppliers, is figuring out which of the suppliers you have out there, current or future or potential suppliers, have a huge strategic potential for your company, and then win the competition for mind share at these suppliers. So not fostering competition between suppliers, but you as a customer are competing for the mind share of the best brains at your suppliers. This is the journey I have gone through. I'm not advocating to be super nice to all suppliers. What I'm saying is figure out the suppliers that are really, really important for you and go for a true partnership. The rest of the suppliers, it can be totally transactional, but differentiate strongly. Are we approaching the time more people will use aerial or amphibian ways of transportation?
I think so. Going in 3 dimensions, you clearly avoid traffic jams. You can jump over a mountain, for example. I mean, nowadays, you could choose to live off the grid, solar cell powered house somewhere in the wilderness, and you jump over the mountain to the city to go to your office if you have to. Definitely going into the 3rd dimension. And now you don't need to be a pilot. You just tell the thing where you want to go and you go. Noise might be an issue. If we can solve the noise issue of the propellers, that's the hurdle. Everything else is solved, but the noise is not good.
That's amazing. And thank you for your realistic assessment of the situation. After all these years of having worked in multiple industries, particularly automotive, as well as in PCs and now intelligent vehicle and transportation, I still see you up and running early in the morning, late in the evening. What is it that's exciting to you at this stage in your career?
Are you familiar with the concept of Ikigai? For your viewers who don't know it, so I think this comes from Okinawa, the concept, and it's a recommendation for a happy professional life. So in order to be happy, you need to do something that you like, that you're good at, that makes you money, and that is good for society, other people. For me, doing what I'm doing in procurement, I found my Ikigai early. So I really enjoy doing this. I plan doing this in one way or the other as long as I can breathe.
That's exciting to hear. I enjoy procurement as much as I enjoy marketing because at the end of the day, it's all about relationships. So maybe you and I should write together on the ikigai of procurement,
Let's
how
do.
you can find your calling in
Yeah.
a profession. I
Yeah.
used to do also product engineering and testing, and that's why it was easier for me to go into procurement. When you're
Yeah.
doing product engineering, quality testing, you start saying, I better know what my vendor is doing, right?
Absolutely.
From an engineering perspective, from a business perspective, those strategic relationships matter. Has all this work changed who you are fundamentally as a person? Or are you still the same old Christian Shu who got into the industry with starry eyes?
I don't think so. Inside, I'm still, I don't know, about 16, 17 years. I've not matured a lot.
So you're still a guy who went looking at
Yeah.
the Mercedes car in Stuttgart, and now
Exactly.
that you're working with amphibian modes of
Yeah.
transportation, you're still
Yeah.
looking at landing on the moon and saying, how can we have vehicles that'll take us different places?
You know, when SpaceX did the first integrated flight test for Starship, I was in a meeting. I had the live stream on the screen, and I was probably paying 90% of attention to that because it was so exciting to see that. So this is why I say I'm still immature.
Well, it's amazing to hear that the child in you is very well alive. It's so much more exciting to find out what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
And this is why I talk to people. I literally hunted you down. I'm like, he writes very interesting things. I need to get to know Christian. And one way is to find out why did he write all this and what is he really up to? So this is why I talk to people. This is why I find my ikigai, learning about the world, trying to make predictions. Making predictions is not easy, as you said earlier. What is your prediction about where this whole transportation industry is going and what kind of new transportations will emerge?
If we talk about a time frame of a couple of decades, I believe additive manufacturing will hugely change the way we do things. It will be very much, you say, I want to have this gadget, and then it will emerge where you need it. This is my prediction over a couple of decades. So a lot less shipping of stuff around the globe. I still have huge expectations for everything vertical. So whatever happens up there in low Earth orbit on the moon and on Mars, I think this will be game changers for us.
So you can see people saying on ChatGPT, give me a vehicle that'll take me from point A to point B, and it'll magically start appearing. Huh?
Yeah.
That's exciting. And Christian, it's a joy talking to you. I have so much more to learn. And maybe we should write that article together
Let's do that,
because
right?
not many people see the amazement in these kinds of professions. even procurement is changing tremendously with all the automation. You can find information easily, you can get data easily. And then the question is, how do you deal with that data? Do you treat it like inanimate data and just maximize for profit? Or do you go that extra mile, create deep relationships? Now, more and more robots are involved in the procurement cycle also when it is less strategic. So do you think the human AI interaction is going to play a bigger role in procurement going forward?
Definitely. I mean, and I can give you an immediate use case for this. If you go into most companies on this planet, now I even include a lot of tech companies, not just automotive industry, and you ask them, so what is the performance of a supplier? Name a supplier, so how good is the supplier? And you ask people in procurement, in engineering, in manufacturing, you will get at least 3 conflicting answers. Companies measure all kinds of things. There are systems with tons and tons of data points, but nobody is able to make sense of this. How good is this supplier compared to another supplier? How does the performance of the supplier change over time? No idea. This is the most fundamental information for anything you do, supplier management, awarding new business to supplier. So the data is there. That would be an immediate application for artificial intelligence internally to understand, make sense of all of this. Equally, there's tons of information published by suppliers, on suppliers. Nobody reads it. You meet a supplier and you have all the relevant information for you in a digestible form. You know what's happening externally, you know what's happening internally. You are unbeatable as a procurement person. For that, you need artificial intelligence. There's no other way to do this. Even if you put an army of people at this, it's not solvable. Only way to solve this is AI.
I agree with you. In fact, I had a former manager, and we were looking at semiconductor supply chain, and he said that we need a dossier. Every time I'm approaching a company, whether it's a strategic supplier or even a transactional short-term supplier, I need a dossier. I need to understand exactly where it is, what the state of the art is, what the competition is like, the entire SWOT analysis, so I can make sense of where and what to do. And essentially, that's what you're saying. That's not easily solvable. Putting an army of people, AI can actually get you that information fairly quickly, slice and dice it in different ways, pie charts, tables, and all that. It's a very dynamic thing. So you need to have it updated on a regular basis.
In real time. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know that some companies are trying to solve that on their own, right? But I don't believe in everyone reinventing the wheel. So what's needed is like what Salesforce is to sales and marketing, right? You need buy force. Entrepreneur picking this up and developing a solution. This is needed across all industries. Every company that's working with suppliers, and this is every company needs this.
It's just like you have a Salesforce having the same kind of intelligence on the buy force, where 50% of the expense of a company can easily go, not just the hardware, software, but even the thought leadership. We spend a lot of time in finding the right suppliers.
Yeah.
So, well, such an amazing conversation. Let's do something about it. And given the complexities are only growing every day, given that in the days of AI, machine learning, given all the connectivity, infotainment, automotive, as well as in all other industries, complexities are growing. I think it's about time we make it a more symmetrical equation, not just how to maximize profits by selling high at the top line, but also how to keep the bottom line and the relationships going on all sides. So thank you for that. And I look forward to many more conversations like this with you, as well as people out there. Please tell me about what you're seeing from your vantage point of view. Has procurement changed? Has the way you think about the buying process changed? And how will that change further with all these emerging technologies? Do you need blockchain, for example, to keep a ledger of the conversations and things like that? Many more open questions there. And Christian, I look forward to again talking and getting into greater depth next time.
Thank you, Shankar.